Hey class, in this video I'm going to talk to you all about Abu Yusuf Al-Kindi, who for the remainder of the video I'll just call Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi is a very important figure in the history of philosophy and its development in the medieval period. He lived and worked in Baghdad, and his dates are there below, in the early medieval period, and he was a key figure in what's often called the translation movement, which is a fascinating and exciting moment in the history of philosophy and science, where numerous Greek texts were translated for the first time into Arabic and later Persian. So I'll give you a brief background on how that goes. Well, for a long time, Greek philosophical and scientific texts had been translated into Latin. Right? This began roughly, we could say, with the Roman conquest of Greece. There was always a sort of an ongoing tradition of translating Greek philosophical works into Latin. And, major figures in this would be, of course, like Cicero, Boethius, Varro, Victorinus, and figures like that. Sort of the recipient of all that translation work was Augustine of Hippo, who we talked about in a previous video. Augustine was very familiar with Greek philosophy through translation or in translation. He read most of his Greek philosophy in Latin, not in Greek. And it's actually a debate amongst scholars about how much Greek Augustine actually knew. We know based on his education that he would have at least known the rudiments of Greek, but how fluent he was is an open question. Well, something similar happens many centuries later in the medieval Arab world. A number of texts begin to be translated from Greek into Arabic. This happens through the mediation of Syriac Christians. These would be Christians who lived in what's now Syria and were familiar with Greek and also their own native Syriac language. And one of the early stages of this translation movement is the translation of Greek philosophical and especially theological texts into Syriac. And if you're interested in that, like probably not at TWU's library, but at other libraries you can find sort of modern editions of these Syriac texts. And it was also translated a lot of theology. A lot of Greek Christian theology was translated into Syriac. Well, with the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate, the political situation changed such that the Syriac Christians were no longer part of the Byzantine Empire, but were rather now subsumed into this Abbasid Caliphate that was headquartered at Baghdad. And this political transformation is what leads to sort of this flourishing of translation, where these Greek-speaking Syriac Christians, once they became familiarized with Arabic, were put to work translating Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic. In this institution that is somewhat mysterious, it's referred to as the House of Wisdom, and amongst scholars there's some debate as to what exactly it was. Was it a library? Was it like a think tank? Was it a club? We don't really know exactly what it was. And anyone that tells you that they know exactly what it was is going beyond what we have evidence for. But we do know that it was something in Baghdad and in this time period. And we do know that Al-Kindi was in charge of it. That Al-Kindi was sort of the manager of whatever this thing was. And he's therefore was in a position to be the first person to write in Arabic on topics and methods and things derived from or inspired by Greek philosophy. This is why Al-Kindi is often considered like the first philosopher to write in Arabic. So the text that we're looking at today is a text from Al-Kindi called The Sayings of Socrates. And it's a weird text, right? It's almost like just this boom, 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 boom list of anecdotes about Socrates. But I think Al-Kindi is doing something serious here that's not immediately apparent to casual readers. And you can see you can get an idea of what Al-Kindi is up to when we look at the first anecdote that's related of Socrates talking to Timaeus. Timaeus is a character that appears in some of Plato's dialogues, and Timaeus is asking Socrates, hey, why don't you write a book? And Socrates says, oh, I don't want to write a book. But the interesting thing is what Timaeus suggests that Socrates should write a book about, which is Tawhid. And I may have mispronounced that. And in Islamic theology, that is the concept of God's absolute oneness, the absolute oneness and indivisibility of the deity. And this is what Timaeus is asking Socrates to write a book about, which means that Al-Kindi is trying to say that Socrates believed in this, and this is why he would write a book about it, that he would write a book affirming this central concept in Islamic theology. Why would Al-Kindi want to do this, since he's clearly under no illusions about what Socrates actually believed, or whether or not Socrates was a Muslim, since Socrates lived thousands of years before any of those events happened. Al-Kindi is trying to make philosophy safe and palatable for his readers that might have some suspicion about this sort of Greek pagan, ancient Greek pagan ideas. So he's trying to make Socrates appear as someone who, while he lived in that time period, did not agree with it, and actually affirmed, a central idea that Al-Kindi's Islamic readers would affirm. The text goes on with other anecdotes about Socrates. And the next one I want to focus on is the one about idolatry. Socrates is having a discussion with a king, and we know that in Athens, in Socrates' time, there was no king, right? They were a democracy, but we can still try to unpack this a little bit. In this conversation that Socrates has with a king, see that Socrates does not worship idols, right? And again, if you know anything about Islamic theology, you probably know that it is dead set against anything that might even resemble idol worship. Anything that might even look like you are worshiping an idol, they are going to be against. So again, Al-Kindi is presenting Socrates as in line with, or as a kindred spirit to Al-Kindi and his co-religionists. The interesting thing about this conversation, though, is that Socrates does not say that nobody should worship idols. Right? He seems to suggest that for some people, it is necessary. And like he says, like for the king, it would be necessary. Now the implication, I think, is that in Al-Kindi's Socrates would say that it is necessary for people who do not have the philosophical insight of Socrates, people who are sort of laboring in ignorance, so that Socrates does not worship idols, he doesn't partake in idol worship, while those that do are, again, acting or laboring in ignorance. So we see Al-Kindi in these passages essentially sort of presenting Socrates as someone who is on the same page as Al-Kindi and his co-religionists, and someone that is not a threat. Socrates seems to be presented by Al-Kindi as the kind of person that sort of would be a Muslim if that was an option available to him in ancient Greece. Right? That's how Al-Kindi presents him. And it's worth comparing this a little bit with Augustine, because these are sort of two paradigmatic religious interpretations of philosophy, right? So Augustine presents Christianity as the fulfillment of philosophy, right? That what the philosophers were looking for all along is discovered in religion. Al-Kindi is doing something very similar, albeit with a different religion, right? That what Socrates was about all along is right in line with Islam. The idea here is that both figures, whether it's Al-Kindi or Augustine, are trying to affect a kind of reconciliation between philosophy and religion. In Plato, philosophy and the figure of Socrates is sort of at odds with the traditional religion of Athens. What both Augustine and Al-Kindi are trying to do is basically say, well, Socrates is not at odds with my religion. Both of them try to suggest that if Socrates, fully understood what their theology was about, Socrates would agree with it. Socrates would approve of it. There's a couple of reasons why I want to go over Augustine and Al-Kindi. First, there's an important transformation in philosophy that happens in the Middle Ages that's often overlooked. And the relationship between philosophy and religion, I think, undergoes a drastic change in medieval philosophy, really because of a change in the religions. Ancient Greek philosophy, right, if you think about Plato and the things we read from Plato and Xenophon, is emerging in a world of myth, where there are all these stories about the gods, and there's lots of gods and all these crazy things, like Zeus is, turning into animals and seducing people. Just all these like crazy stories about the gods. When we get to the medieval period, whatever you may think of the major medieval religions, which would be in this context, in the order that they arrived on the scene, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, whatever you may think of those, that they're much more sober than the Greek myths in the sense that they have a very elevated concept of the divine. The Greek gods are basically just like us, but more powerful. Like they are almost superheroes and or supervillains. While the Abrahamic religions that sort of come to the fore in the medieval period will emphasize sort of the transcendence of God in various different ways, that God is not just like us. God is, not a superhero, but something fundamentally different, right? One way of getting at this is that if you think about it, the Greek gods don't create anything. They are not creators. Right? Creation actually, sort of, if we were to talk about an ancient Greek creation story, that happens long before the Greek gods are ever, around. So the Greek gods are really just super powerful creatures. While in the Abrahamic religions, whichever one you want to pick, God is the creator and not a creature. And so it's a fundamentally different theology. And because of the changes in theology, the relationship between philosophy and religion changes, right? That the question is not about, well, did Zeus really do these things that Euthyphro described Zeus doing? But rather, the question becomes, can we conceive of an uncreated creator or a ungrounded ground that is the principle of all existing things? So in a way, so the change in religions changes the relationship between philosophy and religion. And I think that for the most part, the relationship between philosophy and religion has since then taken place sort of on this, Abrahamic background and never again returns to a mythic background. So that's one reason. Second reason that I wanted to talk about Augustine and Al-Kindi is that we also have a tendency to think of philosophy as something that just happens in ancient Greece with, a bunch of Greeks in togas. So I wanted you to all have a chance to see the diversity of philosophy, but also the unity in that diversity. Ancient Greek philosophy doesn't just belong to the Greeks. It got translated into Syriac and into Arabic and ultimately into Persian, or it got translated into Latin. And so, major work is done on it by Al-Kindi, who's living in Baghdad, and a few centuries later, probably the greatest philosopher of that tradition, Avicenna, is living in modern-day Iran. We go the other direction. Augustine of Hippo is doing most of his writings in Africa. And it's important to see that even very early on, philosophy was a possession of everyone's, not just of the Greeks.